When red wine exploded across the beadwork of my $50,000 rental gown, I simply smiled at my daughter-in-law and told her she had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. Around us, 300 wedding guests gasped, their eyes flicking from her mock horror to my dripping dress. Vanessa Ashford feigned clumsiness, but I saw the truth in her eyes. It wasn't an accident. It was a calculated move to humiliate me. What she did not know was that I had spent 30 years as a forensic accountant. People like me don't forget. We document. We unravel. And when someone tries to bury us in shame, we dig until we find the truth that buries them instead. By the time I walked out of that reception wine, soaking through silk, and my hands trembling with rage, I had already decided her empire would fall. The weeks leading up to the wedding had been a slow descent into madness. From the very first dinner after my son David announced his engagement, Vanessa's glance told me everything. She looked at me as though I were a mismatched chair in her perfect showroom of a world. Her family's wealth poured into every detail. The ceremony at the estate, the Ritz-Carlton reception, the imported flowers from Belgium, every decision screamed excess. Even my dress had been her idea. "You simply must wear something spectacular," she insisted, brushing aside my shock at the rental fee, as though $50,000 were loose change. She called it a gift, but in truth, it was a leash. She wanted me indebted, diminished. And when she deliberately destroyed that dress in front of hundreds, she thought she had succeeded. 3 days later, an invoice arrived from the rental company. $57,000 for irreparable liquid damage. I paid it without complaint, but as I set the receipt aside, a new resolve settled in me. Vanessa had no idea who she was dealing with. 30 years in forensic accounting had taught me one unshakable truth. Everyone has secrets, and wealthy families guard the most dangerous ones. I began pulling threads the way I always had with public filings, SEC reports, and corporate records. On the surface, Ashford Industries gleamed like polished marble. Billions in revenue, pristine audits, glowing analyst notes. But marble is only stone. Pressure reveals the cracks beneath. At first, I found small things. Shell companies with no clear purpose, shipping manifests that didn't match cargo routes, wires routed through odd jurisdictions. Each on its own could be dismissed, but together they looked like the outline of something bigger. I enlisted the quiet help of my old colleague Linda, who still had access to databases the public couldn't touch. She hesitated, asked why I was suddenly interested in the Ashfords. I gave her the only answer I could, a personal interest in understanding their practices. In truth, it was revenge laced with professional curiosity. But as the puzzle pieces formed, it became something far greater. David called around this time, carrying Vanessa's carefully crafted guilt trip. "Mom, she feels terrible about the accident," he said. "Her father wants to cover the cleaning bill." I told him calmly the bill had already been paid, $57,000, and that I had the receipt to prove it. His silence spoke volumes. Vanessa had already lied to him, telling him it was just a regular gown. He still tried to defend her. "It was an accident, Mom." "Of course," I replied. I'm sure Vanessa would never deliberately humiliate someone. He didn't believe me, not yet. But I knew the truth, and every document I uncovered only confirmed what kind of family he had married into. 2 weeks into my digging, I found the first undeniable proof. A subsidiary reported $12 million in cargo, but customs declarations listed only $8 million. $4 million had simply vanished in the paper trail. If it happened at one port in 1 year, it was happening everywhere. Tens of millions hidden, maybe hundreds. Linda sat at my kitchen table wide-eyed as we spread the records before us. "This is systematic," she whispered. And systematic meant deliberate. Then came the invitation I had been expecting. David called again. Mom, Vanessa's father wants to meet you for lunch. He says he has some business opportunities for you. I laughed softly to myself when I hung up. How interesting, I thought. A man who runs a billion-dollar empire suddenly wants to hire a retired accountant. They weren't offering opportunity. They were offering silence. At Romanos, Richard Ashford was all polished charm. He apologized for the wedding offered to cover the dress, praised my career. Then came the real pitch, a consulting role with Ashford Industries. Project assessment, due diligence, perhaps a few subsidiary reviews. I smiled, as though flattered, though I knew the truth. This was a bribe dressed as a contract. Most people would have accepted, grateful for the favor. But Richard made one fatal mistake. He assumed I needed them more than they needed me. What he didn't realize was that his offer gave me something far more valuable than hush money. It gave me legal access to his company's financial records. I accepted with gracious enthusiasm, and 3 days later, a courier delivered boxes of documents to my home. I spread them across my dining table like a feast. Contracts, shipping, manifests, subsidiary ledgers, an entire map of their operations handed to me willingly. They believed they had neutralized me, bought me, silenced me. In reality, they had armed me. And as I highlighted discrepancies and traced wires across oceans, I realized this wasn't just arrogance or greed. This was organized crime masquerading as old money legitimacy. Vanessa hadn't just humiliated me. She had exposed her family to the one enemy they couldn't buy off: the truth. The more I examined the Ashford records, the more chilling the picture became. These were not random inconsistencies or sloppy mistakes. The discrepancies formed patterns that stretched across years and continents. Revenues were underreported in one jurisdiction while inflated in another. Shell charities soaked up millions in donations with no evidence of beneficiaries. Cargo shipments were declared at laughably low values before being sold for far more overseas. It was the sort of web that only made sense when you understood the true purpose: laundering money on a massive scale. Linda came by, often shaking her head, as we uncovered yet another shell entity. If they've been doing this across multiple ports, she said, we're talking about hundreds of millions, possibly billions. I nodded grimly. This wasn't just about tax evasion anymore. It was international money laundering, structured so carefully that it had survived years without prosecution. Until now, not long after David called again, sounding strained. Mom, Vanessa's father says you've been looking very deeply into their businesses. He wants to clarify the scope of your work. I told him calmly I was simply reviewing what I'd been hired to review. But I heard the warning in his voice. They knew I was seeing too much. The following Monday, I was summoned to Richard Ashford's towering office. Patricia Webb, his assistant, guided me through corridors lined with expensive art until I stood before a desk the size of a yacht. Richard slid a revised contract across the polished wood. The new terms stripped me of access to anything useful: no subsidiary records, no international manifests, nothing beyond domestic efficiency reports. In other words, busy work. I studied the language carefully, then pushed it back across the desk. I'm afraid these terms don't provide meaningful value, I said evenly. If you don't want comprehensive analysis, I'm not the right consultant. His eyes cooled, his tone sharpened. Margaret, opportunities like this don't come often. Consider your position carefully. Family relationships can be delicate. It was a threat cloaked in civility: cooperate or risk losing my son. I rose, calmly, purse over my shoulder. Mr. Ashford, you've made a mistake about me. You assume I need your money, your approval, your acceptance? I don't. What I need is the truth. And I'm very good at finding it. His expression hardened, but I smiled, remembering that wedding night when his daughter had poured wine down my gown. Evidence, I told him quietly, has a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times. Then I walked out. By that afternoon, I was on the phone with Sarah, an old contact at the Treasury Department. I had evidence, real evidence, and she was hungry for it. We met in a crowded coffee shop, blending in among laptops and lattes. "Margaret, you brilliant woman," she whispered as she paged through the files. "This is a prosecutor's dream." I had mapped financial connections across 23 subsidiary companies, tying them together with proof of systematic fraud. Conservative estimates placed unreported income at $200 million, with laundering operations possibly exceeding $1 billion. But what chilled me most wasn't the numbers. It was the history. Digging deeper, I discovered the Ashfords had been running these schemes since the 1990s. This wasn't Richard's innovation. It was a family legacy. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, dirty money scrubbed clean through shipping routes and false charities. A dynasty built not on industry, but on crime. When federal agents quietly opened an investigation, the Ashfords felt the pressure. Vanessa invited me to dinner with David at their new house, a palatial gift from her father. The evening was a performance of wealth, rare wines, manicured gardens, magazine-worthy interiors. But beneath the polish, I saw fear. Vanessa probed carefully, asking if I'd found everything I needed in the files. Her eyes were sharp, searching for how much I knew. I replied politely, hinting at inconsistencies in their Caribbean operations. She froze for half a second before smiling too brightly. The dinner had been a test, and I had confirmed their worst suspicion. I was looking exactly where they didn't want me to. Days later, Patricia Webb called, with a message from Richard, a change in project scope, a meeting to clarify expectations. They were trying to tighten the noose. Instead, they revealed their panic. The game was chess, and they believed they were in control. But I had already positioned myself as a grandmaster with Sarah and the Treasury, preparing their pieces behind the scenes. When federal agents finally knocked on Richard's door at 6 a.m., he was arrested for fraud and conspiracy. The news broke that night, reporters crowding outside Ashford headquarters, headlines blaring about financial crimes and ongoing investigations. I watched with a glass of wine in hand, my stained wedding gown still hanging in my closet like a battle flag. It should have felt like victory, but instead, it felt like war. David called, his voice panicked. "Mom, what have you done? Agents are questioning everyone at the office. Vanessa's father was just arrested." My heart clenched at his pain, but I didn't flinch. I told him the truth. I had analyzed his father-in-law's business and turned my findings over to the authorities. He accused me of destroying everything. I told him it wasn't destruction, it was justice. But the words didn't soothe him. That night, I realized I had not only declared war on the Ashfords, but also risked losing my son. The morning after Richard's arrest, my phone rang 3 times before I could finish my coffee. First, my lawyer warned that the Ashfords had hired one of the most expensive defense teams on the East Coast. Second, Sarah from Treasury confirmed Richard had been taken into custody at dawn. Third, David's voice, broken and exhausted, asked if he could come over. When he arrived, his hair was disheveled, his eyes red. "They arrested him this morning," he said, collapsing into a chair. Vanessa's falling apart. His hands trembled as I poured coffee. "Mom, is it really as bad as the news says?" I nodded slowly. "Money laundering, RICO charges, conspiracy. All of it true." David's disbelief cracked as I laid the papers before him. Charities Vanessa supposedly ran, the Maritime Heritage Foundation, International Trade Education Society, Caribbean Development Initiative, were nothing but shells. Millions funneled through them to offshore accounts. David stared at the records, color draining from his face. "She lied to me," he whispered, "about everything." He looked at me, then bitter. "You're happy, aren't you? You wanted to be right." The words stung, but I met his gaze. "I'm not happy you're hurting, but I am not sorry the truth came out." He paced, asking what he should do, now that his wife was about to be indicted. and his home was tied to criminal funds. Start over, I told him. Separate yourself legally and financially. Decide what kind of man you want to be. His shoulders sagged. Can you help me? I promised I would, but only if he swore he had no prior knowledge. He met my eyes and swore he didn't. Despite everything, I believed him. 72 hours later, Vanessa struck back. She sent her lawyer, Marcus Blackwood, to my kitchen. He was the kind of man who carried Harvard law and political connections like a weapon. He accused me of corporate espionage, breach of trust, conspiracy. I let him finish his speech, sipping tea calmly. Mr. Blackwood, paragraph 7, subsection C of the consulting contract specifically excludes concealment of illegal activities. His confidence faltered. He claimed my position had been obtained under false pretenses. I reminded him Richard had hired me after I raised questions about suspicious shipping records. That suggested arrogance, not deception. He shifted tactics, insisting Vanessa's charities were legitimate. I slid folders across the table. $2 million donated for hurricane relief in St. Lucia a year with no hurricanes. $800,000 spent on maritime education programs that didn't exist. He tried to call them errors. I leaned forward, my voice cold. I've tracked financial crimes for 30 years. I know the difference between a typo and systematic fraud. Your client wasn't ignorant. She was running these schemes. Finally, his mask cracked. What do you want? He asked. I told him plainly, truth, justice, and for my son to understand what kind of woman he married. He attempted to play the loyalty card, family above all. I laughed bitterly. Vanessa became family the day she poured wine down my gown to humiliate me. Everything since has been consequence, not revenge. At that moment, my phone buzzed with a message from David. FBI wants to interview me tomorrow. Can you be there? I looked Blackwood in the eye. It seems your client's husband is prepared to cooperate with federal authorities. I'd suggest you advise her to do the same. He snapped his briefcase shut and left without another word. The Ashfords underestimated the power of evidence. They believed influence and intimidation could shield them. But evidence is patient. It waits. And when it surfaces, it destroys. 2 mornings later, David called at 7:00 a.m., his voice shaking. Mom, come over. You were right about everything. I drove to find FBI agents hauling boxes from his house, neighbors whispering on sidewalks. David met me at the door, his face gray. They arrested Vanessa an hour ago. But that's not all. Inside, Agent Sarah Chen was waiting. She spread wire transfer records across his desk. Your daughter-in-law moved $18 million offshore after her father's arrest. Cayman, Switzerland, Singapore. Obstruction, fraud, destruction of evidence. In trying to protect herself, she'd given them more leverage than ever. But Sarah wasn't finished. Vanessa's transactions had led investigators to accounts going back decades. The Ashfords weren't just laundering their own money, they were providing financial services to 17 different criminal organizations. Drugs, arms trafficking. Combined revenues of over $3 billion a year. I felt my stomach twist. This was more than fraud. It was a machine built on human suffering. Then Sarah showed me one final document, the guest list from David's wedding. Among the names was Viktor Kov, a notorious Russian crime boss. He had sat quietly at table 12, just another guest in a tuxedo. The realization hit me like a blow. My humiliation hadn't just been family cruelty. It had been theater. Vanessa had used the moment to display dominance in front of criminals, proving the Ashfords could humiliate anyone without consequence. My son's wedding had been less about vows and more about business. David paled as the truth sank in. She used our wedding to intimidate you, he said hoarsely. It wasn't about marriage. It was about power. I nodded, my anger icy and sharp. For once, David looked at me with clear resolve. What do you need me to do? He asked Sarah. David's question hung in the air like a turning point. Agent Chen leaned forward, her tone firm. "We need you to testify. You've lived inside their circle. You can confirm family dynamics, business ties, and how the money flowed." David looked at me, his face torn between fear and determination. "Will you help me?" I thought of the wine-stained gown still hanging in my closet, and of the women and children whose suffering had been laundered through false charities. "Of course," I told him. "Let's destroy them all." The trial began almost exactly 1 year after the infamous wedding reception. Federal courtrooms are not glamorous. They are stark, unforgiving places where power crumbles before truth. As I took my seat in the gallery, I watched my son 3 rows ahead, dressed in his best suit, jaw set with resolve. The prosecutors unveiled their case methodically: 40 years of systematic laundering, $3 billion in criminal proceeds, ties to human trafficking, and arms dealing. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh spoke with the precision of a surgeon slicing apart the Ashford's reputation piece by piece. When I was called to the stand, I walked slowly but deliberately, knowing every word would be dissected. Mrs. Turner Walsh began. "How did you first become aware of irregularities at Ashford Industries?" I looked directly at the jury. I spilled a drop of water on my daughter-in-law's dress. In response, she deliberately threw wine on my $50,000 rental gown. That humiliation made me curious about what kind of people I was dealing with. From there, I detailed everything: the shipping discrepancies, the shell charities, the offshore accounts. For 6 hours, I answered every question with the discipline honed from decades of investigations. When Blackwood rose for cross-examination, his tone was sharp. His questions designed to paint me as a bitter mother-in-law bent on revenge. "Isn't it true you began this out of anger?" I met his gaze. "I began with curiosity, but what I uncovered created a moral obligation. When you discover evidence of crimes that destroy lives, your personal feelings no longer matter." He pressed harder, but the jury's eyes never left me. I had nothing to hide, and the paper trail spoke louder than any insult. The next day, David testified. His voice wavered at first but grew stronger with each answer. "I thought I was marrying someone who shared my values," he said. "Instead, I married into a family that saw compassion as weakness and the law as something to outwit." He described Vanessa's manipulation, the lavish gifts, the silences he ignored. By the time he finished, he no longer sounded like a naive husband. He sounded like a man choosing integrity over illusion. Then came the downfall that no defense team could spin. Against her lawyer's advice, Vanessa insisted on testifying. She believed her beauty and confidence could sway the jury. At first she smiled and deflected, claiming ignorance. But under Walsh's relentless questioning, cracks spread. When asked to name a single beneficiary of her supposed charities, she faltered. Silence stretched heavy in the courtroom. Finally, in a burst of arrogance, she snapped, "So what if they were? Everyone does it. Everyone with money avoids taxes. The only difference is we got caught." Gasps erupted. The judge banged his gavel, but the damage was done. Vanessa had confessed to conspiracy in open court while showing complete disdain for the law. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Richard received 45 years in federal prison. Vanessa was sentenced to 25. 14 co-conspirators earned between 5 and 30 years each. The empire collapsed overnight, their name forever stained not with wine, but with the truth they tried to bury. Months later, David and I met for lunch at Romano's, the same place Richard had once tried to buy my silence. He stirred sugar into his coffee, his face older but steadier. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought carefully. A year earlier, I had been planning quiet retirement, not federal testimony. Yet here I was, scarred but stronger. "No regrets," I said finally. "Especially not about the marriage ending." You deserve someone who loves you for who you are, not someone who sees you as a shield for corruption." He nodded, then smiled faintly. "Do you remember what you told Vanessa at the wedding? That she'd made the biggest mistake of her privileged life? Did you know then how big a mistake it would be?" I laughed softly, remembering that moment. I knew she'd chosen the wrong person to humiliate. I didn't realize she'd chosen the worst possible person, a forensic accountant, with nothing left to lose. David chuckled at my words, the first genuine laugh I had heard from him in months. "Mom," he said, "next time I get married, will you run a background check first?" I smiled across the table. "Sweetheart, next time you get married, I'm running a background check on her entire family, their associates, and anyone who's ever co-signed a loan with them." "Deal," he replied, raising his coffee cup. For the first time in a long while, we felt like mother and son again, not adversaries caught in the crossfire of Vanessa's world. Life settled into something new after the trial, though not the quiet retirement I had once envisioned. My name appeared in articles about the largest criminal prosecution on the Eastern Seaboard, though I avoided interviews. Fame wasn't what I wanted. What mattered was that the empire had fallen, the victims of trafficking were one step closer to freedom, and my son had been pulled back from a life entangled in corruption. I tended my garden again, roses and lavender, blooming in neat rows. Evidence of patience, of resilience, of what can flourish when you nurture instead of exploit. Sometimes I caught myself staring at the wine-stained gown still hanging in the back of my closet. The deep red blotches had spread across the beadwork, like a wound that would never heal. But I kept it there deliberately, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a reminder of power, the kind that comes from refusing to accept cruelty in silence. Vanessa had thought she was proving dominance in front of 300 guests and half a dozen criminals. In reality, she had set into motion the unraveling of her entire family. That gown wasn't evidence of defeat. It was the spark that ignited everything. David still struggled, of course. He'd lost his home, his wife, and the illusions he'd built his life around. But he gained clarity. He rented a small apartment, started over at work, and began to volunteer at a local nonprofit untainted by scandal. He wasn't healed overnight, but he was healing. One evening, as we planted new bulbs in the garden, he asked me if I had ever been afraid. I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said, "many times. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite it." He nodded, wiping soil from his hands. "I think I'm finally learning that." Months turned into a year. The Ashfords' trial remained a cautionary tale splashed across headlines, a symbol of how arrogance and wealth cannot shield anyone forever. And though I hadn't planned for my retirement to become a battle against organized crime, I learned something vital through it all. Life doesn't always follow the neat path we envision. Sometimes it takes one reckless act, like a glass of red wine spilling down a dress, to reveal exactly what we're capable of. Looking back now, I realize Vanessa gave me an unintended gift. In trying to reduce me to nothing, she reminded me that I was still someone. Someone skilled, someone relentless, someone unwilling to let injustice slide quietly into the night. The forensic accountant inside me hadn't retired after all. She had simply been waiting, and when the moment came, she did what she had always done. She followed the money until the truth appeared. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: never underestimate the strength of someone who has been dismissed. Humiliation can break a person, but it can also forge steel in their soul. Wealth can buy power, but it cannot erase the consequences of deceit. And sometimes the most dangerous opponent you'll ever face is the one you thought was harmless. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story resonated with you, if it made you think twice about appearances, loyalty, or justice, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please, like this video, Share it with someone who needs a reminder that truth always matters. Subscribe for more stories like this and leave a comment below about what you would have done in my situation. Your voice matters.